Kia ora and welcome. Kia ora koutou. My name is Suzanne. I'm from the New Zealand On Air Communications team. Welcome to our New Zealand On Air Round Tahi webinar. I'm soon going to hand over to the funding team to go through Round Tahi and the priorities, of course, for this round. But just before we do, a little bit of housekeeping. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. However, we do want this to be interactive. So if you have questions as we go along, you can either put up your hand using the Zoom reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen, put a question in the chat function, or literally put your hand up and I'll spot you so you can ask your question directly. You may have noticed we're also recording the session and that will be uploaded to our website for those who are interested as well as obviously those who couldn't make it today. So today we have some of the members of the lovely funding team here. Amy Mills, the Head of Funding. They might wave. Kelly Davis, the Associate Head of Funding. Stephen Gadaway, Funding Advisor Development. I believe Hepati Mita is joining us, but perhaps not just yet, Funding Advisor. Gabriel Thomas, Journalism Manager, and Hannah Kim, Funding Administrator. So now I'm going to hand over to Amy Mills.
Kia ora, Suzanne. Thank you. Kia ora koutou, everyone. I was going to do a relatively brief framing up front before we dive into kind of the team breaking down the various aspects of the guidelines going into Round Tahi. Those of you who've come in for funding for us over the years will know that this is usually the biggest funding round of the financial year, and it's the first one. And I think why I wanted to do a little bit of a spiel up top as well was just to acknowledge just how significant the changes are that are going on in the sector at the moment. And what we were doing in the lead up to Round Tahi was thinking very hard about what can we be doing to respond to a sector in crisis within the parameters of our mandate and our remit and what we do. So because we're incredibly aware that, you know, the big changes and announcements happening at the moment, particularly in terms of 3 and the proposed closure of News Hub, the restructuring and the changes happening at TVNZ and wider across the whole sector, you know, it's having massive impacts on content creation opportunities, on employment and jobs. So we've been really thinking hard about what can we be doing, especially going into this first funding round of the new financial year, to try and have the highest impact and support for the production sector, but also the local platform sector. So I was going to speak a little bit about that, but of course, as we go through the guidelines, feel free to be asking questions as you go. I think one of the things, if you've read the guidelines already, probably won't be a huge surprise to people, but we're putting a lot of emphasis on the opportunities around projects that are seeking our funding alongside the screen production rebate, which is still what feels like a relatively new change to the structure of the rebate. So in the past, projects could only get New Zealand On Air funding alongside the rebate if they were children's and animation projects. And partway through last year, with a review of that rebate, it's been opened now to any genres and form of content that can come in seeking our funding alongside the rebate, which we think is incredibly important. It's increasingly important given what's happened at the moment, because it essentially opens up a wider pot of available public funding for local screen production. So we're really trying to work hard to figure out where we can position ourselves and enable as many projects as possible that are of that scale and ambition to be able to try and access it, especially if our funding can support that happening. So that's a real strategic approach, and you'll see it reflected in Round Tahi guidelines as well. I think the other thing I wanted to acknowledge up front is in terms of the proposed changes that are happening at 3, we're getting a lot of questions from the sector and producers in particular saying, what's NZ On Air's position around supporting local content production for 3? And so what we've been saying to everyone, including 3, and we're in regular communication with them, is just to say that we remain really committed to supporting that platform, as in turn they say they are committed to supporting local content production themselves. And the conversations that we're having with them are around saying, we don't want to be reactive to things that might hypothetically happen and things we need to be working with the facts. And at the moment, we've got a significant slate that 3 are still supporting into current rounds and looking to support and roll out across both their linear channel, which is remaining, and also their 3 Now platform, which of course they've publicly stated is becoming increasingly important to them in terms of the positioning of it. So what we would say as well, and what we've said to 3, is that we're going to be talking to them, and what we need are assurances from them as well around audience impact. So any changes that might flow through in terms of what they're proposing, we want to be working really closely with them to understand, are there audience impacts in relation to that, and do we require reviewing and taking deeper consideration in terms of our approach on that basis. So wanted to acknowledge that up front. The other thing I wanted to acknowledge, which many of you will have seen, and I'm sure will be disappointed, is that we aren't supporting games or podcasts into Round Tahi. And in part, that's to do with the fact that, and we have spoken about this publicly a few times, I think, but both formats, in terms of media formats, are incredibly fast growing, and there's huge demand from the production sector. But we're also not able to access a huge amount of insights and data around how audiences are engaging with that locally funded games and podcasts. So we're actually trying to build up, and we've been funding quite a lot of both in recent times. So we're also just trying to build up a kind of greater analysis of what are the audience outcomes of those things that we're funding. We're getting increasing funding asked for those projects, so we have to think really carefully, because we're not getting any increased baseline funding. We're trying to think really carefully about what we're supporting and how, and what we can see is working in terms of audience reach and things. So I think we're just really trying to consolidate in this Round Tahi and focus on those things that we're mentioned already, like the really kind of what's going to offer some scale and sustainability for the sector, and significant levels of employment around production. But we will be open in future rounds to those formats. So we'll be able to communicate that to the sector as we go through. Similarly, we're not taking unsupported content development applications into this round. And that's also, so we're only focusing on content development applications that are coming with platforms attached. And again, part of the reason for doing that is because we've done a huge amount of investment in those unsupported development projects in the last financial year, which has been amazing. And we've seen some incredible projects come through. We're also just trying to be quite mindful about managing demand and supply. And at the moment, we can see with the crisis going on in the sector, we've got to be really focused on what platforms are looking to support and how we can support them in turn, because we want to make sure we've got projects that ideally have that market interest attached to them coming through. So those were kind of the 3 or 4 big key areas that I just wanted to highlight up front. But as I mentioned, we'll be available and we can do questions as we go through the session itself. So I might hand back to Hannah. Is that right?
Yes, kia ora, Amy. I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see. No?
Not yet.
Not yet? Oh gosh, what's happening? How
Oh, no,
about
here you go.
now?
Yep,
Yay.
good to go.
Sweet. Cool. Welcome again to our webinar for Round Tahi. I guess I will kick it off by jumping to the next slide. So, ooh, there we are. Cool. So I'll just quickly go over our timeline for this round. So applications open 9 o'clock on Thursday, the 4th of April, and you have until Wednesday, the 24th of April, 4 p.m., which is the day before Anzac Day, to get your applications in. And the decisions are announced Friday, 5th of July. And so during that time, we'll be working really hard to get all our assessments done and, get the applications funded. Yes. And just want to make a note, if you are a first-time applicant, please register as soon as possible to our portal. So the whole registration process is manual. And we have had in the past people registering maybe like 2 or 3 days before the application deadline. And it just means that you won't have as much time to work on your application. So if you're a first-time applicant, or if you haven't registered yet, do it now. Cool, sweet. And that's my part. Next slide.
Kia ora, Hannah. I think this is where my part starts. So general eligibility, you will need a platform for your project, and that needs to be a local free-to-air platform, whether it's tamariki content development, scripted or non-fiction content that you're seeking funding for. If you want to discuss that with us, if you've got a platform structure or distribution plan that feels a little bit different from the norm, then have a conversation with us just to check that what you've got in mind is eligible for assessment before you put in your application, and we'll be very happy to answer that for you. Starting with non-fiction, we've got a minimum of $12 million allocated for funding in this round. As Amy mentioned, we're looking at giving precedence to projects that are broad, that target a general audience. We're looking for projects that are intended for digital first release as opposed to linear first. And we're looking at larger scale projects. We're really interested in projects that have a bit of scale to them, are going to get a lot of people working if possible. And we will give priority to local formats over international ones if we have a number of projects to choose from. And again, as mentioned, we are not looking for podcast or game applications in this round.
And can I just jump in briefly, Kelly, before we move to the next slide, just around that second bullet point that talks about digital first release, just wanting to be crystal clear as well that this is about, this is ideally for projects that would be linear and digital. The reason we're emphasizing digital first release is just to acknowledge what we're also hearing from the broadcasters, which is that they are positioning their video on demand players as their kind of growth and future strategies. And so what we're really hoping to see, and this probably is more of a wero or a call to the platforms themselves, as we're wanting to see release strategies for local content that see really strong video on demand release with secondary linear play, or what that looks like. So I just wanted to add that in.
Thanks, Amy. And if you've got any questions about nonfiction, you can pop them in the chat, or if you're feeling that you don't want a public question, you can email any of us or email funding at New Zealand, whatever our funding email address is, funding@newzealandonair.gov.nz, I think. Moving on to scripted, we've got, thank you, there's the email address in the chat. We've got a minimum of 10 million that we've allocated for scripted in this round. So we're looking to give priority to applications that are looking for $1 to $3 million in funding. We're not looking to take applications for projects that need under $1 million. So again, that really feeds into this goal of this round to be a bit more focused and consolidate. So we're looking at the slightly larger projects. And as Amy mentioned before, we're going to give priority to projects intended for digital first release over linear. And as Amy said, that's really to reinforce what we're hearing about platforms looking to be digital first as they pivot their strategies.
Kelly, there is a question just come in.
Great.
If I can interrupt you for 2 seconds.
We love questions.
Good. Asking, does the platform support requirement also apply for diverse content development? Is diverse development still a thing this round?
So that's a question about development, and we're going to talk more about development in a minute, but we might as well just answer it now because we want to encourage people with questions. We are just looking for platform supported development in this round. We, Amy, Stephen, jump in. We don't still talk about diverse development, do we, as a specific strand?
We talk about supported and unsupported applications. We had hoped to be looking at unsupported this round, but given the climate, as Amy iterated at the start of this webinar, our priority is supporting the platforms at the moment and keeping the flow of their projects happening so that they can keep meeting our audience expectations. So this round development will be platform supported only.
Thanks, Stephen. And we've got a slide about development in a couple of slides from now, so we can discuss that in more detail if needed. I think in the scripted space, I've pretty much covered it, but let's move on to, I think the next slide is about the rebate, which is kind of flows pretty well from scripted. So we are open to rebate projects in this round. We've got new guidelines around our approach to spur rebate projects, which is linked to in the guidelines that have been published on our website and that you may have had an email about. We are open to all types of projects that are looking to access the rebate, whether that's non-fiction, scripted, or tamariki content, either non-fiction or scripted. We are looking to be last in funders on rebate projects. So your application should demonstrate that you've got your finance plan pretty locked, you've got strong letters of interest, and that you just need that last bit of funding in order to unlock the entire finance plan. This is because we want to make sure that we're getting projects underway as soon as possible and getting people working and results on screen. And that's very much the case for everything that we're looking to fund in this round. We're really wanting to see that you've got shovel-ready projects as far as possible. And as with Round Tahi, we want to fund up to 2.5 million per rebate project. So if you've got an ask that's higher than 2.5 million for your rebate project, we encourage you to come and have a chat with us before you put in your application, just so that you can have some confidence as to whether or not it would be accepted.
And can I add to that as well, Kelly? So those of you who are interested in the space and have been following some of the decisions we've made in the last couple of rounds, like we have on occasion looked at putting in more than the 2.5 million. And an example of this was for the Gone. And in large part, that was because of the strength of the entirety of its business and funding case. So we were being asked for about a quarter of the funding, even though the ask from us was higher than the kind of guidepost cap that we'd talked to. So I think that would be the other note to make around people wanting to seek more than that. It is about talking to the strength of your funding case, because the idea that we could be unlocking really significant international third-party financing is where we might consider going above that. And we've sort of landed on that 2.5 mil because we are trying to support the greatest number of projects into the sector as possible and make sure that public funding goes as widely as possible. And the only other thing I would add to this slide is that the other thing we're trying to consider at the moment is the time frame with which our funding stays attached to these projects provisionally. So even though we're saying we want to be last in funders, we do also recognise that last in is there's complexity around that when you've got multi-party financing and very intricate finance packages and distribution advances and working with broadcasters. You know, it's an incredibly complex beast to pull these types of projects together. So what we're saying is we're trying to look for the projects that feel like they have the strongest case for completion and going into production, but we recognise sometimes as well that that might take longer. We've said 6 months, and this was in large part kind of advised on by the sector itself. We talked to quite a few producers who'd worked in the rebate space, and what we're trying not to do is tie up really significant levels of the contestable funding, you know, year on year. So the idea is the funding goes in, gives you the best chance of ensuring that all those pieces of the puzzle can come together. We're willing to consider extensions on a case-by-case basis, and we've been asking producers to share with us the intricacies of where they're at and what's required. But by and large, we're also trying to make sure, for fairness for the sector, that that money is flowing back into the funding pot as it needs to within the funding year as well, if it looks like those projects won't go ahead.
Kia ora, Amy. We did have a question, I think, did we, Suzanne, about last in funding? Yeah.
I was just checking with Victoria if that had answered that. Yeah. Perhaps Victoria, you might like to jump in and ask. Oh, you're on mute, Victoria.
Sorry. God, you would have thought I got that sorted by now. Amy, thank you. I think you did really answer the question. I think the issue that we've been looking at is that so many international partners have said to us that they won't be, they want to talk to us once we've got a local broadcaster online. So we have had very good support from TVNZ, but we're not expecting to hear from them until the 4th of April. So by the time that leaves a very, very tight window for us to get an international partner by your deadline. And obviously I don't want to leave it until the 24th before I actually upload my application. So I was really wanting to know what your expectation was around that last in piece of the last in funding criteria. But Amy, I think you did really cover that it's more about the intention and about a project that has a really good chance of getting into production rather than seeing solid contracts by then.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it is a great question. And I think that the other thing that it's worth noting is that we are looking across this financial year in particular to support rebate projects in every one of the rounds. So the only thing I'd say is there might be others coming into Tahi who have already got the broadcaster commitment in time that's meant they've been able to raise international finance, etc. And of course, they would be in a sort of more attractive position going into this round. But equally, I think as long as you're talking to us and able to demonstrate in your application the process you're going through, you've got local broadcaster commitment and you've been having these conversations with international parties, etc. Our team's very open to just working quite closely with people to get as much information and to be conscious that things can update quite fast. So you're able to be updating us throughout the process. You might have submitted the application, but in 2 weeks' time, you get some interest from a market partner and you can immediately come back to us and update that, and we'll make sure that information flows through into the assessment process.
That's great. Thank you.
Brilliant. Let's move on from the rebate then, if we haven't got any more questions. Thanks, Hannah. Music and sync licensing. So just as with Round Tahi, you can add up to 250,000 for music or sync licensing on top of your budget. This fund, this sum should be excluded when you calculate your platform's license fee. And the funds need to be ring fenced in your budget and they can't be used for anything else. This is only available for scripted projects. And it's definitely something that if you've got questions about how that works, you should have a chat with us prior to putting in your application. Next one, development. So we touched on this a bit earlier. We are open to only supported development applications in this round, and we would like to see that your platform is contributing as well, ideally with match funding. We don't expect to fund a large amount of development in this round. We've got a limited amount of puti available, and we're really going to be looking at for development that's got a very clear breakdown of what's required and what the path to production will be, so that we can feel really confident that we're putting funding toward projects that are likely to get up sooner rather than later. Did you want to add anything to that one, Stephen?
Just that if anyone has any questions about their development applications and they want to go over them prior to applying, just flick me an email. It's just stephen@nzonair.godbt.nz. So yeah, I'm happy to talk to anybody prior to them sending the application in.
And that's Stephen with a V.
Yes, and an N. I'm not a Steve. I'm not fun enough to be a Steve.
So I think we're learning that spelling email addresses is just not a good strategy. It's too hard. We also, just to the point about supported and unsupported development, we did fund quite a lot of unsupported development in Roundrua of 2023. And it may well be that we're able to in a future funding round. We're just trying to take a prudent approach right now.
Oh, jumping in there, Kelly, there's just a question from Yale who's asking, are you happy to share the level of development support this round?
Do you mean the total amount available that we will have to distribute, or how much we're looking at per application.
Yael, are you happy to jump up and clarify your question?
Hi, I'm not sure. No, thank you. It was both really. But I did see a sneak preview to the next slide, so I may have jumped the gun.
Should I jump in on that? Because I don't think it is on the next slide, is it?
I don't think so. No.
No. Are you happy for me to jump in, Stephen, or did you want to tackle that question?
If you could talk about the total amount available.
Yeah, so we're broadly looking at about a maximum of 250k is what we think we might have available in this round. And of course, we don't, because we're limiting it to supported development, it may be that we don't get close to that amount. What we've tried to do is, because we have the 3 funding rounds across the year, we've tried to kind of evenly distribute the content development funding across those 3 rounds. So, but there is money available in that, but we are only looking at the supported development. So like I said, it might come in under that amount, in which case that just allows for greater allocation in future rounds.
And in regards to how much you're applying for, this is going to be super unhelpful. You need to be submitting an application where the budget matches the work that you're planning on doing. So it needs to be a realistic budget for what you see as the next stage of the development that you're going to do. So we don't have any prescriptions of it must be exactly X amount. It needs to reflect what you need to do. We're trying to keep it as flexible as possible because different projects get developed in different ways. So you're applying to get support for the next stage of the development for your project as you see best, and an accurate assessment of how much that is going to cost.
Because Stephen's right, what often happens is if you just give a figure, that becomes the ceiling, and then everybody comes in asking for that maximum amount. But what we did say in the guidelines, I think, was we sort of put a number of around 25 to 30k was what we might expect per project, but that's really only on the basis of what we've seen platforms willing to match, fund and support. So again, that's not a hard and fast rule. What we would just say is you'd want to be talking to your supporting platform, and by all means, if you can lobby and advocate for them to be willing to chuck 40k or more into the mix, because you can see the value of what kind of writers' tables or development you need, to Stephen's point, then we'd be really chuffed to see higher levels of development support from platforms if they're able to stretch to that. So that was more of just a guide of what we've traditionally seen coming in from platform supported projects.
Wonderful, thank you.
We really like to see development applications that demonstrate a really good insight into what the project needs next to get it to where it's going to be production ready or the next stage of its development. Really good insight into the strengths and weaknesses of what you've got at the moment. Okay, let's move on to tamariki. So this is the number that Yael saw, I think, that we've got 3.5 million allocated for tamariki content in this round. That is both non-fiction and scripted projects. We are going to give priority to projects that are over 500,000 or to rebate projects that are looking for gap funding to finish their finance plan. So this is in line with the general scope of the round. We would love to see projects with multiple platforms and really strong audience strategies to reach the audience that your project is aimed at. You do still need a local platform for tamariki projects. That it could be a secondary platform, but it does need to be a local platform in your distribution mix.
And can I add one clarifying note to that, Kelly, because those of you who have seen in the newsletter and the guidelines that have gone out the link to those rebate guidelines we mentioned, it's worth you just looking into the fine print of those around children's, because we have acknowledged that actually for children's it's incredibly challenging to get a local platform secured in advance. So we've just noted that in those instances we might be willing to consider children's rebate projects if they've got some strong market interest, but haven't managed to secure a local broadcaster. We're just willing to have those conversations with producers about specific projects. So just worth, if you are in that space, having a look through those rebate guidelines closely.
marketing. So we want to see people creating good marketing assets for their productions to make them discoverable, and you can allocate up to $15,000 to marketing or asset creation in your budget. This, like sync licensing, needs to be ring fenced and not absorbed into other budget lines if later on in your production. So, and it's just a general note really that we're expecting to see lines for promotion and asset creation in all budgets that we receive. In addition to that, we do have the option of discoverability campaigns. So if you would like your project to be eligible or considered for a discoverability campaign, there's an opt-in box that you can tick in your application. So if it is selected for funding, it may be also considered later on down the line when it's produced for a marketing and discoverability campaign with an agency that we use. It says here to talk more about that. No, but if you've got any questions about that, go ahead.
Sorry, can I jump in again, Kelly? Because one thing I was going to add for producers is that we're working alongside the platforms in this whole conversation, because as you'll be aware, if you've got a platform supporting your project, the platforms themselves, in theory, especially the larger broadcasters, have marketing teams and have publicity teams that are attached and involved across projects that they're commissioning. So what we've been talking to the platforms about is wanting to make sure this process is incremental to anything that the platforms are committing to doing, and that it's done in collaboration with the platforms, so that it doesn't feel like producers are going off on one side and creating assets or campaigns that aren't in line with what the platform's intending to do. But I think what we're really trying to acknowledge is that it's becoming increasingly challenging for the platforms and the broadcasters to put more resources into marketing and promotion. And of course, that has a flow-on effect in terms of the discoverability and access to our beautiful funded content. So what we're really hoping here is that you'll, as a producer, you might have a project and you've got platform support, and you could talk to them and say, if I'm putting 15K into my budget, is it wise to try and find an independent publicist? Because actually, let's say it's TVNZ or it's Three's publicity team might acknowledge that actually this project would fall outside of the scope of what they could help support. So we're really looking for producers to be thinking about how this works complementary to what the platforms are doing, and additive, and is maybe plugging gaps that are there, so that we're doing just the best possible job of getting the content out in front of local audiences.
Did we have a few questions about that, Suzanne?
Sorry, I was just checking actually, Kate, if you feel that Kate asked a question, but she thinks perhaps Amy answered that. Are you happy, Kate?
Yeah.
You are?
Yeah, I was just, for instance, I did a project with RNZ last year, and the rollout was slightly tricky. So it's great to know that you guys are going to be supporting platforms with the new way that things get distributed, because there's so many different ways that it can happen now.
That's right. And what we were hearing as well from both producers and platforms is, 15K isn't huge, but it might be the difference between a producer being able to create some bespoke social assets and do some boosted posts that the platform's fully supportive of and wouldn't be able to stretch to do themselves, and that could work brilliantly. Similarly, with when we're talking about those large scale discoverability campaigns, of which we're only going to be able to support a small number of projects, but that might be a campaign that has quite a lot of value behind it. Doing that in tandem with the platform to acknowledge they might be doing all of this amazing work themselves with their own internal promotions and on-air promos, etc. But we might be able to do some amazing targeted, in specific communities, targeted ad shells, outdoor advertising and things. It's trying to work really closely to the benefit of platform and producer, and to the kind of aid the project. So it's a relatively new area for us, and I think we're all learning. So it can be a bit messy, I think, but we're all up for kind of trying to figure out how to do this best. So as long as producers come to us and talk to us if you're not quite sure how it's working, so that you can feel more versed in that when you're talking to the platforms as well.
Oh,
There's actually another question too from Julian about what you were talking about earlier, Amy. Do you have a link to understand more about the rebates around tamariki platforms?
That's Suzanne, you should be able to do that once. That'll be whatever the link is in the guidelines that links out to the spur.
Oh, literally a link.
That's-
It's got to
that's-
Julian.
Yeah, if we
Yeah,
just could stick that in
I
the
should
chat.
pop that in for you. Not a problem.
And Julian, just for your reference around children, so it basically has a note that says we understand it might be hard to secure the local platform up front because for a lot of our local platforms, understandable reasons, although it's still challenging, commitment to children's is not a priority in terms of their commercial mandate. And so when you've got a rebate project coming into us seeking significant money, you can see the challenge for local platforms possibly attaching to those projects going into the round because they'll see it competing against some of their other priorities that might have a greater commercial mandate. And so what we're trying to say to children's producers, if you've got a rebate project, is you will have to get a local platform attached in order to meet the rebate threshold in the end, but we are willing to consider with you the sequencing of when you do that, and if you can get into market with some great collateral for your project and get some market interest that looks likely to be able to hit a rebate threshold, and then you secure the local platform after, we want to be kind of open to those discussions. So that's kind of the section in the guidelines that you'll see once you have a look at them.
Pop the guidelines up now, the link.
Okay, thanks. Well, we'll move on to limits on applications. So in order to ensure that we're not overwhelmed with applications, and also so that we can ensure that the percentage of applications that are successful doesn't become unbelievably low, we instituted a few rounds ago limits on the amount of applications that platforms and production companies can submit. So if you're a production company, you have an upper limit of 4 applications per funding round, but that is a maximum of 2 per category, and categories include scripted, non-fiction, and development. Platforms can put in up to 10 applications that they support. There are no restrictions per category for platforms, but there are some projects that don't count to that 10 that a platform may support, and those include tamariki projects and returning series.
And sorry, I feel like I'm always jumping in, but I was going to say, we are also open to hearing from people if there's a clear rationale for why those caps might be exceeded, and we're having that particularly in line with platforms and things. So we are open to talking about what that looks like if you're above the cap, but we are, like Kelly said, incredibly mindful that we're able to fund at the moment about 30% of what's coming into us. So it's really trying to do right by the sector as well in terms of people's efforts.
So just talk to us before you put the applications in if you want to exceed the limit or you've got any queries about it. That's better than just putting in 6 and running away and hoping we don't notice. More questions?
Not at the moment. Oh, sorry. Yes, there is one at the top. Apologies, Tim. He's saying, as this round's key audience focuses on general, will a future round have a focus on priority audiences?
I think the answer to that, yeah, sorry, I was just finding my mute. I think the answer to that is yes, but what we're also just trying to do is, because in theory, most of our rounds are open to both, and we're not saying exclusively you can't bring in priority audience applications into this round. We're just trying to be really realistic with the sector about responding to what's going on at the moment. And at the moment, we're hearing from across the board, it's about scale productions, broader reach, employment opportunities. So that's why we're saying it's going to take precedence and priority. It's not to say you're excluded from bringing those projects in. And I can't speak yet to the future rounds because everything in the sector is changing so fast. It may very well be that we need to take that priority approach across the next couple of rounds again, but we'll be signalling that in advance to the sector as we go.
Thank you. Got another message comes through. How do you define local format versus international? Asks Martha.
So that's to do with IP, Martha. So if we were to receive applications for a formatted show that is an international format that will require a format fee, or there are applications for a non-fiction show that is a New Zealand generated format, then the New Zealand generated format would be would have the edge in that situation. That's what that's referring to.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Any other questions coming in? Feel free to jump in if you want to take yourself off mute and out directly. Right.
It's been good to have so many questions, actually.
That is good.
Not
It
too
is.
bad. Yeah.
Right. Anything to add, funding team?
I think the big message is talk to us, talk to us, talk to us. So if you've got questions, something comes up or you're not clear or the guidelines don't make sense to you, or you've got a project that is unique in some way, talk to us and we will do our best to advise you.
And I did pop those rebate guidelines, the link into the chat. However, it is a horrendous looking link, or URL, I should say. So if you go to the funding section on New Zealand On Air website and look under current rounds, you'll find those they'll be pretty easy to find there.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Most welcome. Any final questions? Just
Hi, it's Nishan here from Trajectory Media.
Hi.
I'm trying to phrase this as diplomatically as I can. Does NZ On Air have a view around supporting web series, given that there are some issues with news platforms' capability to support them? Like, has anything changed that we need to be aware of in that space?
Can you speak a little bit more to that, Nishan? I'm conscious you were trying to word it diplomatically, but what do you mean in terms of web series? Are you saying that there's changes to commissioning? Do we have enough? Yeah, could you just speak a bit more to that?
Well, for example, Stuff no longer seems to be supporting web series, and the performance of not just our recent project, but I know of others was, I don't know how to put this, disappointing. Viewer figures dropped by something around 90%. NZME, for example, is supporting web series, but in a much more limited basis. The spin-off seems to be only really supporting their own projects by their associated production company and not external projects. And so our view is that the space, in the kind of context of this already dire crisis, the space for alternatives is also either shrinking or there are some problems. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, no, I think I know. Yeah, I think it's a really fair question, and it's a hard one to answer, because in some ways, we have long had the funding distribution model that we had, which is we require a local platform to support the content coming into us for production funding on the basis that that is the pathway to audience. So when you are looking at constrained public funding, you're wanting to make sure that what you're funding has a really good chance of getting in front of local eyeballs and has that reach. So that's why the model exists. And of course,
right.
Points you're raising are kind of that's where we start to enter challenges, is what's being commissioned and why, and what the position of the platforms are. What we have, this doesn't help you in terms of your particular question and your projects necessarily, but what we have worked really hard on recently is looking at audience research that provides an evidence base for where we might not require the local platform attachment. And you're probably aware where that has been the most prevalent is in the youth and the rangatahi audience space. So that's why we have taken a different tack in that area, where we've got a very, very strong audience evidence base saying this audience is in these spaces, and they are largely international platforms, they're streaming platforms, they're social media platforms. So we've worked really hard to build what we think is a kind of a scaffolding around how our funding can legitimately and reasonably go towards those international platforms. You know, things like wrapping quite strong marketing promotion support, having the strength of EPs attached to these projects made by rangatahi, trying to reach rangatahi audiences. I think it becomes harder for us to open those floodgates to broader audience content. And I think it also has a really significant flow-on impact in terms of the local platform ecosystem. So there's no easy answer to it.
Yeah.
I think it's useful to hear you talking about it though, because I think we're having regular discussions with those digital platforms, and so we could be raising that and kind of trying to challenge some of those things that are happening and find out why, because we don't want to see them becoming closed shop either, but we also recognize they're probably under their own constraints to survival.
To be blunt with you, some have already done that. I mean, some are already closed. I speak of stuff in particular have moved just purely just TikTok style short form video. They're not entertaining the web series that they used to support.
Yeah.
But I have a follow-up question. Do I understand what you were saying earlier to mean that we could look at trying to develop things to reside on YouTube or other social media platforms?
Yeah, if you're targeting youth audiences, and we've just, and I'm very happy to actually have chats with you directly about the initiative that we just rolled out within My Reach, which had a whole guidelines around it and a process for funding projects. And we've put 5 million towards that initiative, which came from one-off funding the government gave us in this financial year, because we wanted to experiment with that model and try and do something new. And what we're hoping to achieve in this financial year is that we might see youth projects coming into general rounds. We're not opening them up for applications in Round Tahi, only because we've literally in Round Toru gone through this huge surge of funding, and we want to be able to take the time to analyse and look at what's working with that. But I think that's something we could absolutely talk about. And I think the other thing I just thought of to add is that I do think conversations with RNZ, and I know they're just one doorway, but because they have the radical sharing approach to their content, being a public service broadcaster, they are an interesting party to talk to. And there's hope you might have around them being a commissioning gateway, but then that content being able to reach to some of the other platforms as well, of the NZMEs of the world and the spin-offs are open to content sharing. That's what we were always hoping we might see in this space, and recognising it's got harder to do it, but that does still feel like there's an opportunity for those conversations as well.
Who would be best to speak to about this? Because yeah, I mean, this would be something that this is the space we work in a lot.
Do you mean at RNZ or?
I mean at NZ On Air.
I mean, I think what I would be most useful to do is go through that email with the query, because whomever in the funding team is available, we can, we're all across these kinds of issues, and we can just feed in accordingly. And whether it's Kelly and myself joining those conversations, we can definitely be having them.
Okay, great. No, thank you. That's really helpful.
I saw there was a question from Martha. Is that what you're going to jump in, Suzanne?
Was, but you far away, yep.
So Martha, your question was, is there a percentage of the budget you'd recommend applying for? Is it case by case? It's definitely a case by case, but I was going to add that what we're seeing in the rebate space, if that's an area that you are interested in, is at the moment we're seeing an interesting kind of, it's early days because we've only run a couple of rounds, but we're sort of getting around the 30% budget ask coming in to us. And that can vary. Every project's going to be so different, whether it's a factual series or a scripted drama, but we were seeing, especially in the scripted drama space, that the whole of the budget that wasn't able to be filled with international financing and rebates seemed to be sitting around the 30% mark. So that might be a useful guidepost if you're in the rebate space. But if it's a domestically funded production, we're usually a very large percentage of the budget, but we're increasingly trying to ask platforms to meet us and provide significant cash contributions or match funding where it makes sense, etc. But it's not always easy in this environment. So
cool, thank you, very helpful.
Any other questions? Simon? Yes, we are going to come to a close. Anything else to add, funding team? If not, we can round things up. thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate you obviously taking the time. As mentioned, please check out the funding page on our website, or you saw the email there, funding@nzonair.govt.nz if you have specific questions. And with that, we shall leave you to your day. Ka kite.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.